The laugh cut through the cabin like a crack of ice snapping underfoot. Sharp, unapologetic. It came from the aisle, from a woman in a pressed navy uniform who hadn't even bothered to lower her voice. A few heads turned, a few didn't. The man in the window seat stiffened. The woman in the middle seat felt it land squarely on her chest. She did not look up right away. She kept her eyes on her hands, folded neatly over a worn leather purse resting on her knees. Her breathing slowed, deliberate, controlled. She had learned long ago that reacting too fast only fed moments like this. Around her, the economy cabin of Silverway Airlines hummed with the tired impatience of a late afternoon departure out of Cleveland Hopkins. Overhead bins slammed shut. A child kicked the back of a seat. The air smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and burned coffee. "You sure you're in the right seat, Mom?" the attendant said again, louder this time. The laugh came back, softer now, shared with a colleague who pretended to check a seat map, but didn't hide her smile. The woman in the middle seat finally raised her head. Her name was Ruth Bennett. 65 years old, grey threaded neatly through her close-cropped hair. No jewelry worth noticing at first glance. No makeup beyond a thin line of lipstick that had been reapplied carefully in an airport restroom mirror. She looked like someone's retired school principal, or a grandmother on her way to visit family. The kind of woman people spoke over without realizing they were doing it. "This is 32D, Ruth said calmly, tapping the paper boarding pass against her knee. "Middle seat." The attendant glanced at it, then at Ruth, then laughed again. Not cruel enough to cause a scene, not kind enough to be harmless. "Huh," she said. "Must be a mistake. These rows usually fill last." Ruth didn't ask what that meant. She knew. The plane door was still open. The jet bridge groaned as another wave of passengers shuffled aboard. The other attendant, a man in his late 40s, with deep lines carved around his mouth, shifted his weight. His name tag read Daniel Moore. He watched the exchange without intervening, eyes flicking between his colleague and Ruth, calculating risk the way seasoned employees always did. Ruth slid her boarding pass back into her purse. The leather creaked softly. She felt the familiar weight of it, grounding her. Inside were not just tissues and mints and reading glasses, but a thin folder she had reviewed twice already that day. Notes written in careful block letters. Names circled, margins filled. Silverway Airlines. She had boarded this flight on purpose. The attendant moved on, her heels clicking sharply against the aisle floor, already bored. Conversation resumed in low murmurs. A woman across the aisle shook her head almost imperceptibly, then looked away. No one said anything. No one ever did. Ruth had lived long enough to understand that silence was rarely accidental. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the engines whining louder, Ruth stared at the seatback in front of her. The plastic tray bore scratches, small white scars left by years of use. Someone had carved their initials near the latch. She traced them with her eyes, feeling the slow burn settle in her stomach. Not anger, exactly, but something colder, more patient. Up in the front cabin, the mood was different. Laughter flowed easily. A pre-departure drink was poured, and refused, and poured again. The flight lead, Karen Whitfield, stood near the galley, reviewing her checklist. 58 years old. 29 years with the airline. She had started when Silverway still mattered, when pilots wore caps proudly and passengers wrote thank you letters. She sensed tension the way sailors sensed weather. But today her attention was split between an upcoming audit and a staffing shortage that had left her with two attendants who barely spoke to each other. Karen made a note to check on the back cabin after takeoff. The seatbelt sign chimed. The aircraft climbed, banking east before leveling out, the city shrinking beneath a blanket of cloud. Ruth closed her eyes briefly as pressure shifted in her ears. She thought of her late husband, of how he used to grip the armrest during ascent, no matter how many times he flew. She exhaled slowly and opened her eyes again. Daniel pushed the beverage cart down the aisle an hour later. His movements were efficient, practiced. He offered Ruth water with a polite nod. She thanked him. Their eyes met for half a second longer than necessary. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or caution. The other attendant, Melissa Grant, hovered a few rows back, watching. 32 years old, new to Silverway. Quick smile, quick judgments. She whispered something to Daniel as she passed him. He didn't respond. Ruth sipped her water. The plastic cup crinkled slightly under her fingers. She watched condensation bead and slide. Outside the window, the sky was a flat, endless blue. She thought about the meeting she would attend the next morning in Dallas. Thought about the conference room with its glass walls and long table. About the men and women who would sit there in tailored jackets, speaking in measured tones about margins and labor costs and brand trust. About how many of them had never sat in a middle seat in decades. Her phone vibrated silently in her purse. She didn't check it. Behind the curtains separating economy from the forward cabin, Karen spoke quietly into the intercom, confirming arrival time. Her voice carried authority, shaped by years of being ignored and persisting anyway. She stepped out into the aisle, scanning faces, reading posture. Her gaze landed on Ruth for a moment. Karen noted the straight back, the stillness. Not fear, not entitlement. Something else. A sudden jolt rattled the cabin. Turbulence. A few gasps. Melissa laughed nervously near the rear, gripping a seat back. "Guess this old bird doesn't like company," she muttered, loud enough to be heard. Ruth felt the plane settle again. She tightened her hands around her purse. The leather shifted, and something inside pressed briefly against the side. Solid, reassuring. A reminder of why she was here. She had not come looking for trouble, but she had come looking for truth. And before this flight was over, Silverway Airlines was going to show her exactly who it was now. The turbulence eased, but the tension did not. It lingered in the cabin like a held breath no one dared release. Ruth Bennett adjusted slightly in her seat, careful not to draw attention. She had learned that stillness could be its own kind of armor. Around her, the economy cabin settled back into its uneasy rhythm. Pages turned. A cough echoed. Somewhere behind her, a man muttered about his knees. Melissa Grant stood near the rear galley, arms crossed, watching the aisle with thinly disguised irritation. She hated this section of the plane. Hated the way the seats were narrower, the smiles rarer, the passengers older and slower. She had bid for better routes, better cabins, and been told to wait her turn. Today felt like another reminder of where she stood. When her eyes drifted back to Ruth, something hardened behind them. Not anger, assumption. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. He had spent too many years watching small things turn into disasters. He leaned closer to Melissa as he passed her again, voice low. "Let it go," he said. "Seats assigned. No issue." Melissa scoffed under her breath. "You ever notice who always gets those seats?" she said quietly. "Middle, back, always the same." Daniel stopped the cart, just for a second. "Yeah," he said. "People who paid for them." She rolled her eyes and turned away. Ruth pretended not to hear, though every word landed cleanly. She stared out the window now, watching the faint curve of the horizon. Her reflection stared back at her, distorted by double-pane glass. She looked smaller there, less solid. She wondered, not for the first time, how many people mistook quiet for weakness. Her purse rested against her thigh. Inside it, beneath a folded scarf and a paperback she hadn't opened, was a small velvet case. It had been her mother's once. Before that, her grandmother's. Ruth had debated leaving it at home, but habit won. It had been with her through courtrooms and conference halls, funerals and celebrations. A reminder that she came from something older than board votes and balance sheets. Karen Whitfield emerged from the forward galley, clipboard tucked under her arm. She walked slowly down the aisle, checking seatbelts, overhead bins, posture. The practiced sweep of someone who knew what to look for. She paused briefly beside a man arguing with his tray latch, resolved it with a twist of her wrist, then continued. When she reached Ruth's row, she stopped. "Everything all right here?" Karen asked, voice even, professional. Ruth looked up. Karen saw her eyes then. Clear, steady, not asking for rescue. "Yes," Ruth said. "Thank you." Karen nodded, but did not move on immediately. She glanced at the seat assignment card tucked into the pocket in front of Ruth. 32D. She made a mental note. As she stepped away, she caught Daniel's eye and raised an eyebrow. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. The cart rattled forward again. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers stood stiffly, stretching legs, shifting weight. A man across the aisle bumped Ruth's arm without apologizing. She didn't react. The world had taught her where reactions were wasted. A few rows back, Melissa raised her voice suddenly. "Ma'am," she said, sharp enough to cut through the low murmur. "You can't stand there." Ruth turned. An older woman had paused in the aisle, fumbling with a cane. Daniel stepped in quickly, guiding her back to her seat with a calm smile. Melissa huffed, shaking her head. Ruth watched the exchange closely. The pattern was familiar. Not cruelty, not outright, just impatience directed in one direction only. She reached down, adjusting her purse. As she did, the strap slid. The purse tipped, struck the edge of the seat, and spilled partially into the aisle. It happened quickly, too quickly. The velvet case rolled free, stopping near Melissa's shoe. Time seemed to stretch. The sound of the engines deepened. Ruth felt her stomach drop, not from fear of loss, but from recognition. She knew this moment, knew how it would unfold. Melissa looked down. Her expression changed. She bent, picked up the case, and turned it over in her hand. "This yours?" she asked, loud enough for several rows to hear. "Yes," Ruth said, already reaching. Melissa pulled her hand back slightly. "What is it?" Ruth held her gaze. "Something personal." Melissa hesitated, then opened it. The ring caught the cabin light immediately. Deep blue, old cut. The stone wasn't flashy in the modern sense, but it held weight. History. It did not belong in an aisle carpet. A few heads turned. A low whistle sounded from somewhere behind. Melissa's mouth twitched. Then she laughed. Not loudly, not fully. Just enough. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Didn't expect that." Ruth rose slowly from her seat, knees stiff but steady. "Please close it," she said, "and hand it back." Melissa didn't. Her eyes flicked to Ruth's clothes, her shoes, her seat number. She looked up and down Ruth's body, as if searching for a missing piece that would make the picture make sense. "You sure this didn't get mixed up?" Melissa said. "We had a woman up front earlier with something similar." Daniel froze mid-step. Karen turned sharply from the front. Ruth felt heat rise in her chest, but her voice remained calm. "I am certain." Melissa smiled thinly. "Just asking," she said, "because things do go missing on flights. Happens more than people think." The cabin had gone quiet now. Not silent, but aware. Karen was moving fast. Ruth extended her hand, palm up. "Give it back," she said, firmer now. Melissa hesitated, just long enough to make it clear this was no accident. Karen arrived beside them. "What's going on?" she asked. Melissa lifted the ring slightly, as if presenting evidence. "Found this in the aisle," she said. "Was just making sure it belonged where it's supposed to." Karen looked at the ring, then at Ruth, then back at Melissa. "Give it to her," Karen said. Melissa opened her mouth, closed it again, then complied. The velvet case dropped into Ruth's hand. Ruth closed it carefully, fingers steady despite the thudding in her ears. Karen turned to Melissa. "Galley, now." Melissa flushed, eyes darting to the watching passengers. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, too quickly. Karen didn't argue. She didn't need to. As Melissa stormed away, Ruth lowered herself back into her seat. Her hands trembled now, just slightly. She hated that. Hated the cost moments like this exacted, even when she refused to pay them publicly. Karen lingered. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Ruth met her gaze. "I know," she replied. But in her mind, Ruth was already writing, already framing sentences, already placing this moment exactly where it belonged. This was not about a ring. This was about who was believed and who was laughed at, and what an airline thought dignity looked like when no one important was watching. And the most important people were always watching, whether anyone noticed or not. Karen Whitfield stood in the aisle for a beat longer than protocol required. Long enough for the passengers nearby to register that something had shifted. Long enough for Daniel to read the set of her shoulders and know this was not over. Then she straightened, nodded once at Ruth, and moved toward the galley with the kind of controlled urgency that did not invite questions. The cabin noise crept back in cautiously. A cough, the rustle of a newspaper. Someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Ruth kept her eyes forward, her spine upright, the velvet case now secured deep inside her purse. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. Not panic. Recognition again. This was the part people never saw. The aftershock. The quiet tax exacted long after the words were spoken. Across the aisle, the woman who had shaken her head earlier leaned slightly toward Ruth. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely moving her lips. That wasn't right. Ruth turned, met her eyes, and gave a small nod. Gratitude, not absolution. The woman leaned back, relief flickering across her face at having done something. Anything. Up front, the galley curtains snapped shut. Melissa stood with her back to the counter, arms folded tight, jaw clenched. "She made it sound like I accused her of something," she said to no one in particular. Her voice shook with indignation. "I was just doing my job." Karen didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She closed the curtain fully, sealing off the space. "Your job," she said, "is not to speculate. It is not to comment. And it is absolutely not to laugh." Melissa scoffed. "You saw that ring? Come on, be realistic." Karen's eyes hardened. "I'm being realistic. Realistic about lawsuits, about witnesses, about patterns." "What pattern?" Melissa snapped. Karen stepped closer. "The one where you look at a passenger and decide who they are before they open their mouth." Silence fell heavy between them. The hum of the aircraft filled the gap. Daniel hovered near the jump seat, pretending to secure a latch. He kept his head down, but he listened. Karen lowered her voice. "You're done for today. Sit. Don't speak to another passenger unless I instruct you to." Melissa's face flushed. "You can't just bench me." "I can," Karen said evenly. "And I am." Melissa laughed then, a brittle, humorless sound. "Over one misunderstanding." Karen held her gaze. "Over a choice." She turned and left the galley. Back in economy, Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. The plane rocked gently. She focused on the sensation of movement, on the low vibration beneath her feet. She had not expected this. Not this version. She had anticipated indifference, perhaps mild neglect, not open ridicule, not the old familiar arithmetic of worth performed in a stranger's eyes. Her phone vibrated again. This time she reached for it. A message from Thomas Avery. Just her name, followed by a question mark. She typed slowly, thumbs steady. In the air, observing. We'll call after landing." She slipped the phone away. Thomas Avery had known her for 20 years. He had been a junior associate when she still took notes by hand. He understood brevity. He would hear the rest soon enough. 2 rows ahead, a man in a business casual jacket leaned back and muttered to his seatmate. "Unbelievable," he said, "over a piece of jewelry." Ruth heard him. She always did. She wondered if he realized how small he sounded. The flight continued. Meal service arrived and passed. Ruth declined, her appetite gone. Daniel paused briefly, offered her another water. His eyes carried an apology he could not voice. She accepted the cup with a nod. Karen returned once more, checking seatbelts before descent. When she reached Ruth, she stopped again. "May I speak with you after we land?" Karen asked quietly. Ruth considered her. The lines at the corners of Karen's eyes told the story of years spent managing other people's mistakes. "Yes," she said. "I think that would be wise." Karen exhaled, just a fraction. "Thank you." As the plane began its descent into Dallas, the light shifted. Late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long bands of gold across the cabin. Ruth watched it move across her hands. She thought of time, of how many moments like this she had endured, documented, filed away. How many decisions had been shaped not by numbers, but by the way people behaved when they thought no one powerful was present. The wheels hit the runway with a jolt. A few passengers clapped out of habit. The plane taxied, slowed, stopped. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Karen's voice came over the intercom, calm, controlled. "Please remain seated for a moment." A ripple of confusion followed. People craned their necks. Bags stayed put. Karen stepped into the aisle, walked back toward Ruth. Her heels clicked softly. She stopped beside her row. "Miss Bennett," she said, clearly now, "if you wouldn't mind." Ruth stood, slowly. The cabin watched. She felt it then, the collective recalibration. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed. People noticed her posture, her stillness, the way she did not rush. Karen gestured toward the front. Ruth followed. As they moved, whispers rose and fell like static. "Who is she? Did you see the ring? That attendant went too far." At the front of the cabin, the door remained closed. Through the small window, Ruth could see figures waiting on the jet bridge. One of them straightened when she came into view. Thomas Avery adjusted his jacket. His hair was thinner than it used to be, his face drawn with worry, but his eyes were sharp, always sharp. Ruth met his gaze through the glass. The door opened, and for the first time since boarding, the cabin understood that whatever had just happened was not finished. The jet bridge door opened with a hiss, letting in the muted roar of the terminal. Ruth stepped forward, and the air changed. Cooler, heavier, smelling of disinfectant and stale coffee. Thomas Avery waited just beyond the threshold, his jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened in a way that suggested urgency rather than comfort. He did not reach for her. He did not smile. He studied her face first, reading the lines around her mouth, the set of her jaw. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Ruth nodded once. "I am." Karen remained at Ruth's side, posture straight, eyes alert. "I'll give you a moment," she said to Thomas, then hesitated. "I'll also need to make a report." "You will," Ruth said, without looking at her. "And it will be accurate." Karen swallowed and nodded. She turned back toward the aircraft, already bracing herself for the conversations waiting inside. Thomas gestured down the jet bridge. They walked together, unhurried, letting the distance do its work. Travelers passed them in a blur, dragging suitcases, speaking into phones, laughing too loudly. None of them recognized Ruth. That was the point. "You said observing," Thomas said. "This wasn't what we discussed." "No," Ruth said. It was worse. They reached the terminal entrance. Thomas stopped near a support column, out of the flow of traffic. He lowered his voice. Tell me. Ruth did not rush. She described the laugh first, then the questions that weren't questions, then the moment the ring touched the light and the air changed. She did not embellish. She did not editorialize. She named actions, tone, timing, silence. Thomas listened, his face tightening incrementally. He had negotiated mergers, dismantled hostile bids, stared down congressional committees. He knew what reputational risk felt like when it crawled up the spine. And witnesses? He asked. Plenty, Ruth said. None eager, a few brave. Thomas closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, something had settled. We need statements. Not yet, Ruth said. I need context. He frowned. Context? This wasn't an accident, she said. It was comfortable. That tells me it's rehearsed. They walked again, past a row of empty gates, toward a quiet corner where the noise thinned. Ruth stopped, set her purse down on a bench, and opened it. She removed the velvet case but did not open it. She rested it between them. This, she said, is a trigger, not a cause. Thomas nodded slowly. You're saying the culture invited it? I'm saying it rewarded it, Ruth replied. Until today. A few minutes later, Karen approached, her expression composed but strained. Ms. Bennett, she said, I've secured the incident logs. The attendant has been removed from duty pending review. Ruth met her gaze. Good. And the rest? Karen hesitated. The rest? The environment that made her confident, Ruth said. The signals she read before she opened her mouth. Karen's lips pressed together. We'll look into it. Ruth lifted the velvet case, slid it back into her purse. You'll do more than look. Karen nodded again, slower this time. Yes, ma'am. Thomas watched the exchange with interest. He recognized leverage when he saw it, and this was not bluster. This was calibration. They parted ways, with Karen returning to her duties. Thomas and Ruth headed toward a small conference room tucked near operations, the kind used for irregular operations and late-night negotiations. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Thomas took a seat. Ruth remained standing. You're thinking about pulling, he said. I'm thinking about pausing, Ruth replied. There's a difference. The board won't like it. Ruth looked at him. The board doesn't get to like things. They get to understand them. He leaned back, exhaled. You know what this does to the timeline. I know exactly what it does, Ruth said. It slows it. That's the point. She moved to the whiteboard, uncapped a marker, and drew a simple line. She wrote words along it. Training, oversight, incentives, accountability. This is what I came to see, she said. Not your projections, not your promises, your reflexes. Thomas watched her hand move. He thought of the polished deck he'd presented last quarter, of the applause, of the quiet warnings he'd dismissed as noise. You're not going to say who you are, he said. Not yet, Ruth said. Names change behavior. I want truth. Thomas nodded. Then we proceed carefully. Ruth turned to him. Carefully is how this happened. Silence held the room. Outside, the terminal pulse is on. Planes arrived, planes departed. The machinery of normalcy continued, indifferent to the small fracture that had just opened beneath it. Ruth finally sat. The chair creaked softly. She felt the fatigue then, settling into her bones. She welcomed it. It meant the day had mattered. I want a full review, she said. Anonymous reports, pattern analysis. I want to know where laughter is tolerated and where silence is expected. Thomas wrote quickly. And the attendant? She is a data point, Ruth said, not the thesis. He looked up. You're going to make enemies? Ruth smiled faintly. Not kindly. I already have them. They just don't know it yet. Her phone vibrated again. This time she answered. Yes, she said. A pause. Then, no, not today. Another pause. Tell them I'm listening, and that listening has consequences. She ended the call, slid the phone away. Thomas studied her. They'll figure it out. They always do, Ruth said. Usually too late. She stood, shouldered her purse. The weight inside was familiar, steady. We'll reconvene, she said, after I've seen enough. As she reached the door, Thomas spoke. Ruth. She turned. This airline needs money, he said, but it needs something else more. She met his eyes. Dignity, she said. And dignity costs less than ignorance. It just requires courage. She opened the door and stepped back into the terminal, blending once more into the flow. Another traveler, another face, unremarkable. Behind her, Thomas sat alone, staring at the whiteboard, understanding finally that the real turbulence had only just begun. Ruth did not go to baggage claim. She moved past it, past the carousel crowds and the familiar choreography of impatience, toward a quieter corridor marked Authorized Personnel Only. Thomas followed without question. He had learned when not to ask. The airport at this hour revealed its other face. Maintenance carts humming softly, floors buffed by machines instead of shoes, voices lower, everything stripped of performance. They entered a service elevator. The doors slid shut with a dull thud. For a moment, neither spoke. Ruth watched the numbers descend. Her reflection stared back at her in the brushed metal. Older than she felt, sharper than she looked. She thought of the laugh again. How casual it had been. How practiced. The kind of sound that came from someone certain of the hierarchy. The elevator opened onto a narrow hallway. A small conference room waited at the end, lights already on. Inside, two people looked up as Ruth entered. One was a man in his early 40s, clean-cut, corporate calm baked into every movement. James Keller, Regional Operations Director for Silverway Airlines. He rose immediately, hand extended, smile ready. Ms. Bennett, he said, I didn't realize you were still on property. Ruth did not take his hand. She acknowledged him with a nod and took the seat at the head of the table. Thomas sat to her right. The second person, seated farther down, remained still. A woman in her late 30s, black blazer, hair pulled back tightly. A tablet resting flat on the table. Her eyes met Ruth's briefly, then dropped. This is Olivia Price, Keller said. Human Resources. She was briefed on the incident. Ruth studied Olivia for a moment. She saw tension there, not guilt, something closer to fatigue. Briefed how? Ruth asked. Keller's smile tightened. There was an interaction on board that didn't meet our standards. Ruth leaned back. The chair creaked. That's an interesting way to describe it. Keller cleared his throat. We take these matters seriously. Do you? Ruth said. It was not a question. Silence settled. Olivia shifted slightly, fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet. Ruth turned to her. How long have you been with Silverway? Olivia looked up, surprised to be addressed directly. 7 years. And in those 7 years, Ruth said, how many complaints have you processed involving tone, laughter, or so-called misunderstandings in economy cabins? Olivia hesitated. Keller opened his mouth, then stopped himself. Enough to notice a pattern, Olivia said carefully. Keller shot her a look. Ruth noticed. She always did. What pattern? Ruth said. Olivia inhaled slowly. That the same behaviors repeat, and that they are rarely documented the way they happen. Words get softened, context disappears. Ruth nodded once. Thank you. Keller interjected, with respect, we have protocols, coaching, progressive discipline. Ruth turned to him. Her gaze was steady, unblinking. Protocols are only as honest as the people enforcing them. Keller shifted in his seat. We're not here to litigate culture. That's exactly why I'm here, Ruth said. Thomas leaned forward slightly. James, this review was already sensitive. Today elevated it. Keller exhaled through his nose. This airline employs thousands of people. One comment cannot define us. Ruth's voice sharpened. One comment can reveal you. She stood. The room felt smaller suddenly. Here is what is going to happen, she said. I am not making a decision today. Not on funding, not on timelines. What I am doing is widening the lens. Keller frowned. Widening how? Ruth looked at Olivia. I want anonymized internal complaints from the last 5 years. Not summaries, originals. I want exit interviews. I want route-specific data. And I want to know who gets promoted and why. Keller stiffened. That's proprietary. Ruth smiled faintly. So is your survival. Thomas watched Keller's jaw tighten. This was the moment resistance usually surfaced. It did not disappoint. You're overreaching, Keller said, with all due respect. Ruth stepped closer to the table, resting her hands flat against it. You laughed at the wrong woman today, she said quietly. Not literally, systemically. And systems do not get the benefit of doubt. Olivia looked up sharply. Keller flushed. That was not, Ruth cut him off. I am not interested in intent. I am interested in impact. The words hung there, heavy, unavoidable. Karen Whitfield appeared in the doorway then, having changed out of her uniform jacket but not her posture. She hesitated, reading the room. Come in, Ruth said. Karen did. She stood near the wall, hands clasped. Karen has been with this airline almost 3 decades, Ruth said to Keller. She saw this coming before I did. Keller's eyes flicked to Karen. Is that true? Karen met his gaze. I've reported variations of this for years. Keller stared at her. Why didn't this escalate? Karen did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. Because escalation requires belief. Silence again. This one deeper. Ruth straightened. This is not a crisis meeting, she said. It is an inventory of habits, of silence, of who is protected and who is exposed. She picked up her purse. You will hear from my office within 72 hours. Until then, do not attempt to get ahead of this. Do not sanitize. Do not coach witnesses. Keller swallowed. And the attendant? Ruth paused at the door. She turned back slowly. She will face consequences proportionate to her actions, but she will not be your scapegoat. Karen's breath caught. That role, Ruth continued, belongs to leadership. She left the room. Thomas followed, closing the door behind them. In the hallway, the airport felt different now, charged, like the seconds before a storm breaks. You didn't tell them who you are, Thomas said. No, Ruth replied. I told them who they are. They walked toward the exit, footsteps echoing. Outside, the night air pressed cool against Ruth's face. She paused, looking back through the glass at the building that never slept, never reflected unless forced. Somewhere inside, people were already rewriting narratives, choosing words, preparing defenses. Ruth adjusted her grip on her purse and stepped into the dark. This was only the beginning. Ruth did not go home that night. She checked into a modest hotel near the airport, the kind built for delayed flights and quiet reckoning. Beige walls, neutral art, a desk bolted to the floor. She placed her purse on the bed and stood for a moment without moving, listening to the distant rush of traffic, the faint hum of the air conditioner. Her body finally registered the day. A dull ache settled into her shoulders. She welcomed it. Pain meant she was still paying attention. She sat, opened the purse, and removed the velvet case. She did not open it. Instead, she set it beside her phone and the thin folder, aligning them with care. Objects told the truth when people would not. She took out a pen, uncapped it, and wrote a single line on a yellow legal pad. Pattern, not incident. The phone rang. She let it ring twice before answering. "Yes," she said. Thomas's voice came through low and tight. "They're already calling it an isolated event." "Of course they are," Ruth said. "Keller's asking for parameters. He wants to know what qualifies as sufficient remediation." Ruth smiled faintly. That's not his question to ask. He's nervous. Good. A pause. "Karen called me," Thomas said. "She's shaken, but she's steady." "She always is," Ruth replied. "That's why they've kept her where she is." Another pause, longer this time. "Ruth," Thomas said, choosing his words, "you're putting weight on a structure that wasn't designed to carry it." "I'm testing it," she said. "There's a difference." She ended the call and set the phone face down. The night passed lightly. Ruth slept in fragments, waking with thoughts fully formed, then letting them go. She dreamed of hallways and doors that opened into other hallways, of voices muffled by glass, of laughter that echoed too long. Morning came pale and early. At 8:15, she walked back into the airport, not to depart, to observe. She took a seat near a busy gate, the kind with families and standbys, and the low-grade anxiety of uncertain boarding. She watched the agents work, their hands, their eyes, who they greeted first, who they rushed, who they apologized to, and who they corrected. A man in a blazer argued about a carry-on. The agent placated him with a smile. A woman with a walker asked a question about pre-boarding. The agent sighed, then answered without looking up. Ruth noted it, not as judgment, as data. Her phone vibrated. A message from Olivia Price. "Do you have a moment today?" Ruth typed back, "I do." They met an hour later in a quiet cafe off the main concourse. Olivia arrived early, coffee untouched. She looked tired, more tired than 7 years in human resources should make someone. "Thank you for coming," Olivia said. "Thank you for asking," Ruth replied. Olivia glanced around before leaning in. "They're circling," she said. "Legal is advising minimal exposure. Communications wants to frame it as training reinforcement." "And you?" Ruth asked. Olivia hesitated. "I think training is what you do when you want to look busy." Ruth nodded. "And culture is what happens when no one's grading." Olivia exhaled. "I've tried to push for deeper reviews before. They get labeled disruptive. Disruption is only dangerous to people who benefit from stillness," Ruth said. Olivia looked at her, really looked this time. "Who are you?" Ruth held her gaze. "Someone who doesn't need this airline to like her." That was enough. They talked for 40 minutes, about metrics and silences, about how complaints from economy cabins were coded differently, how laughter never made it into reports, how tone was always subjective unless it came from the front. When they parted, Olivia's shoulders were lighter. Ruth returned to her hotel room and opened her laptop. She began to write, not an email, a memo, the kind that lived longer than outrage. She outlined expectations without flourish. Independent assessment. Anonymous reporting protected by external counsel. Route-specific observation. Leadership accountability tied to compensation. At noon, she stopped, ate a simple sandwich, drank water, stretched her hands. At 1:30, Thomas called again. His voice carried a different edge now. "They know," he said. "Know what?" Ruth asked. "That you're not just a reviewer." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. "Then they're late." "They want a meeting," Thomas continued. "Full leadership. Tonight." "Tonight is reactive," Ruth said. "Tomorrow morning." "They're pushing." "Then let them," she replied. "Pressure reveals fractures." She hung up and packed her purse. The velvet case went in last. At 5:45, she stood in the terminal again, not hidden this time, still unannounced. People passed. No one recognized her. That was fine. A young gate agent approached her with a practiced smile. "Ma'am, can I help you find your gate?" Ruth smiled back. "No, thank you." The agent nodded, already turning to the next person. Equal. Efficient. Ruth felt something ease. Karen Whitfield joined her moments later. No uniform now, just a simple jacket and slacks. She looked relieved to see Ruth. "They're nervous," Karen said quietly. "They should be," Ruth replied. "It means they understand risk." Karen hesitated. "I've been thinking about leaving," she admitted. "After today." Ruth looked at her. "Don't." Karen blinked. "Don't." "Stay," Ruth said. "People like you leaving is how patterns survive." Karen swallowed. "I don't know if I have the energy." Ruth placed a hand briefly over Karen's. "You have the credibility. I'll help with the rest." They stood together as the evening crowd thickened. Flights delayed, tempers short. The machinery of travel grinding on. At 7:10, Thomas appeared, flanked by two men in suits who scanned the area too carefully. He nodded to Ruth. "They're ready." Ruth adjusted the strap of her purse. She felt the weight settle against her side. Familiar, steady. As they walked toward the conference room, Ruth thought of the laugh again. How small it had been. How loud it had become. This was the part no one saw. The hours after. The choices that determined whether a moment became a footnote or a fault line. The door ahead opened. Ruth stepped through. And this time, she did not blend in. The room went quiet when she entered. Not the awkward quiet of politeness, but the kind that settled when people realized the meeting they thought they were having was not the one that had arrived. 12 people sat around the table. Men and women in their 50s and 60s, most of them. Suits that cost more than Ruth's entire outfit. Phones placed face down. Legal pads aligned just so. The air smelled faintly of coffee and restraint. James Keller stood. "Ms. Bennett," he began, already too formal. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice." Ruth did not sit. She placed her purse on the table instead. The sound was soft. It carried anyway. "I didn't agree to meet," she said. "I agreed to listen." A few glances were exchanged. Thomas took a seat near the end, silent now, his role complete for the moment. Karen stood against the far wall, hands folded, watching faces she had worked beside for decades. Ruth scanned the table. She did not rush. She let the silence stretch until someone shifted uncomfortably. It was a small test. Who broke first? Who waited? A man with silver hair and a pinstripe suit cleared his throat. "We understand there was an incident," he said. "We regret—" "Stop," Ruth said. The word landed flat. Final. "This is not the part where you regret," she continued. "This is the part where you listen." She reached into her purse and removed the thin folder. She opened it and slid a single page across the table. It stopped in front of Keller. He glanced down. His color changed. "This is a timeline," Ruth said. "Not of yesterday, of the last 4 years. Dates, routes, complaints, outcomes." Another executive leaned forward. "Where did you get this?" "From your people," Ruth replied. "The ones who stopped believing you wanted to hear it." A murmur moved around the table. Controlled, contained. Ruth finally sat. "Yesterday," she said, "a woman laughed at me because she thought she could. Not because she hates me. Not because she woke up cruel. Because nothing in this system has taught her not to." Keller opened his mouth. Ruth raised a hand. "This is not about that attendant," she said. "She is not the point. She is a symptom." The silver-haired man leaned back. "We've invested heavily in training." Ruth turned to him. "Training teaches words. Culture teaches reflex." Silence again. He looked away. Ruth folded her hands on the table. "You want to know why I flew economy?" she said. "Why I sat in the middle seat? Why I didn't announce myself?" No one answered. No one needed to. "Because titles distort behavior," she continued. "People perform when power is visible. I wanted to see who you were when it wasn't." She let that sink in. "I'm not here to threaten you," Ruth said. "I'm here to decide whether you are worth partnering with." That word shifted the room. Partnering. Not investing. Not rescuing. The General Counsel spoke for the first time. "With respect, Ms. Bennett, you haven't disclosed your position." Ruth met his eyes. "You know enough." He nodded slowly. He did. Ruth leaned back. "Here is what will happen next," she said. "You will not issue a statement. You will not suspend your review. You will not blame one employee." Keller frowned. "And if we don't agree?" Ruth smiled, just slightly. "Then I leave, and I take my interest with me." That landed, harder than any threat. "Your airline does not need capital," Ruth said. "It needs trust. Capital follows trust, not the other way around." She stood again. "I will give you 48 hours, not to respond, to reflect." Karen shifted against the wall. She had never seen anyone speak to this table like this, not even regulators. As Ruth turned to leave, the silver-haired man spoke again, softer now. "What do you want to see change first?" Ruth paused. She looked at Karen, then back at the table. "I want to see who you promote," she said. "And why." She left without another word. The hallway outside felt longer on the way out. Karen followed, catching up just before the elevator. "They're shaken," Karen said. "They should be," Ruth replied. "Shame is a signal, not an endpoint." Karen hesitated. "You never told them." Ruth pressed the elevator button. "They don't need the headline yet." The doors closed. Karen exhaled. "You know what they'll call you," Karen said quietly. Ruth looked at her reflection in the mirrored wall. "They always do." The elevator opened. They stepped into the night-lit terminal. Somewhere behind them, phones were already lighting up. Calendars being rearranged. Narratives being drafted. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was what happened next, in the quiet, in the middle seats, in the moments no one thought would be measured. Ruth adjusted her purse on her shoulder. The weight was still there, steady. Tomorrow she would decide whether this airline could carry more than passengers, whether it could carry responsibility, and whether the laugh that started it all would be remembered as an ending or a beginning. Morning came without apology. Ruth woke before the alarm, the room still grey, the city outside muted by early fog. She lay still for a moment, listening to the soft, mechanical breath of the hotel. Somewhere below, a truck reversed with a steady beep. Ordinary sounds. The world continuing, indifferent to decisions that would soon ripple through it. She showered, dressed, moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned not to rush moments that mattered. The purse went over her shoulder last. Its weight settled where it always did. Familiar. Unavoidable. Downstairs, the lobby television murmured about markets opening lower. A scrolling headline mentioned airline stocks under pressure. No names yet. Speculation always arrived before facts. Her phone buzzed as she stepped outside. 48 hours felt generous yesterday. Today they want guidance. Thomas. Ruth typed back. Guidance is not a shortcut. I'll see them at 10. She walked back into the airport as if she belonged there, which she did. Not because of access, but because she understood the machinery better than most of the people running it. The smell of pretzels and coffee hit first. Then the noise. Wheels on tile. Voices overlapping. 1,000 small urgencies colliding. She stopped near a security checkpoint and watched. A man in a blazer argued with an officer about liquids. His voice rose. The officer remained flat, procedural. Behind him, an elderly woman struggled to lift her bag onto the belt. No one moved to help. Ruth stepped forward, lifted it without comment, set it down gently. Thank you, the woman said, breathless. Ruth smiled. Of course. It wasn't charity. It was instinct. The kind you developed when you stopped waiting for permission to be decent. At 9:45, Karen Whitfield joined her near a quiet gate. She looked tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from anticipation. They didn't sleep, Karen said softly. They're afraid you'll walk. I might, Ruth replied. Karen studied her. You're serious. I'm always serious, Ruth said. I'm just not always loud. They walked together toward the conference room. This time, the door was open before they reached it. James Keller stood, phone in hand, eyes flicking up as they approached. Ms. Bennett, he said, we're ready. Ruth entered first. The room was arranged differently now. No casual sprawl. Chairs pulled closer, notebooks open. The silver-haired man sat straighter. The general counsel had brought an assistant. Coffee cups sat untouched. Ruth took her seat. She did not speak. The silence stretched, longer than yesterday, longer than comfort allowed. Finally, Keller cleared his throat. We've reviewed your materials, he said, and we acknowledge gaps. A careful word. Gaps. Ruth waited. We're prepared to commit to a comprehensive review, Keller continued, including third-party consultation. Who selects them? Ruth asked. He hesitated. We would propose. No, Ruth said, calm, firm. You will accept. The general counsel leaned forward. Ms. Bennett, with respect. That introduces trust, Ruth said, which is what you're missing. Another pause. Keller nodded once. Understood. Ruth leaned back. Tell me about promotions, she said. Specifically, how many frontline supervisors in the last 3 years came from economy-focused routes? No one answered immediately. Karen felt it before Ruth did, the weight of the question. 2, Keller said finally. Out of how many? Ruth asked. 17. Ruth nodded slowly. And how many complaints originated in economy cabins? The assistant glanced at her tablet. 74%. Ruth did not react. She let the numbers exist in the room. Heavy. Inconvenient. Here is what I will recommend to my partners, Ruth said. Not promise. Recommend. Every ear sharpened. I will recommend conditional engagement, she continued. Not funding. Not yet. Oversight. Keller swallowed. What does that look like? "It looks like you agreeing to be observed," Ruth said, without knowing when, or by whom. A murmur, controlled, uneasy. "You want mystery shoppers?" someone said. Ruth shook her head. "I want truth." She stood, walked to the window, looked down at the tarmac where planes lined up, patient, obedient. "For years," she said, "you have trained people to look up, to perform upward. I want to know how they behave sideways and down." She turned back to the table. "And I want Karen Whitfield in the room when decisions are made," she said, "not as a courtesy, as a counterweight." Karen's breath caught. Keller looked at her. "Karen is invaluable operationally, but you don't see her as strategic," Ruth said. "That's your mistake." Silence again. The silver-haired man spoke carefully. "And if we agree to this structure," Ruth met his eyes, "then I stay in the conversation. Not invest, not rescue. Stay." He nodded slowly. "And if we don't?" Ruth picked up her purse. "Then this airline will continue exactly as it is. And eventually, the market will notice what I did." She walked toward the door. This time, no one tried to stop her. Outside, the hallway felt different, less charged, more exposed. Karen followed. Her voice trembled. "You just changed everything." Ruth stopped and turned to her. "No," she said. "I gave them a choice." They stood there for a moment. Two women the system had learned to underestimate in different ways. "What happens now?" Karen asked. Ruth adjusted the strap on her shoulder. "Now we watch." They parted at the junction where passengers funneled toward gates. Karen headed back to her flight. Ruth blended once more into the crowd. A boarding announcement echoed overhead. "Group 5. Ruth smiled faintly. She moved toward the line, took her place behind a family juggling backpacks and a man scrolling his phone. No one looked twice. That was fine, because power, real power, did not announce itself. It waited, and it remembered. Group 5 moved slowly, always did. Shoes scuffed the floor. Backpacks bumped hips. Someone sighed too loudly. Ruth stood in line without shifting her weight, eyes forward, hands resting lightly on the handle of her small carry-on. She felt the familiar mix of impatience and resignation around her, the low-level friction that came from knowing you were last and expected to be grateful anyway. At the podium, a young gate agent scanned passes with practiced speed. His smile was professional, not warm, not cold. Efficient. He looked up when Ruth stepped forward. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Ruth replied, matching his tone. The scanner beeped. He glanced at the screen. 34E, middle. "Overhead space is tight, but we'll do our best." "I'm aware," Ruth said. "Thank you." He nodded and handed back her pass. No hesitation, no evaluation. Ruth felt something loosen in her chest, just a fraction. This was how it was supposed to work. Not kindness, competence. The jet bridge hummed underfoot. The plane smelled newer than the one from yesterday. Fresh plastic, clean carpet. The illusion of improvement was always easiest at the surface. Inside the cabin, Karen Whitfield was already at her station near the forward galley, uniform crisp, posture alert. Their eyes met briefly. Karen gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Ruth returned it and kept moving. Row 34 was near the back. A man already occupied the aisle seat. Late 40s, corporate casual, knees spread just enough to claim territory. He looked up as Ruth approached, then back to his phone. Ruth waited. After a beat, he shifted, barely, not enough. "Excuse me," Ruth said, voice level. He sighed, exaggerated, stood, and stepped into the aisle with a huff that suggested inconvenience had been inflicted upon him personally. Ruth slid past, settled into the middle seat, and buckled in. The seat creaked under her weight. The armrests were already warm. She adjusted her bag beneath the seat in front of her. The velvet case stayed inside her purse. She did not need it today. As boarding continued, Ruth watched. She always watched. A woman with 2 children struggled with a stroller. No one moved at first. Then Daniel appeared, took the stroller without comment, stowed it, smiled at the kids. Ruth noted it. Melissa was not on this flight. That absence was loud. The plane pushed back on time. The engines rose. The cabin tilted skyward. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, letting the climb settle into her bones. Service began early. A different crew today. New faces, new habits. The cart rolled down the aisle. A young attendant stopped at Ruth's row. "Coffee, tea, or water?" she asked. "Water, please," Ruth said. "No ice?" "Yes, please." The attendant smiled, genuine this time, or at least practiced well enough to feel that way. She handed over the cup with both hands. "Let me know if you need anything." Ruth thanked her. The attendant moved on, offering the same tone to the next passenger. No shift. No downgrade. Ruth took a sip. The water was cold, clean. The flight leveled out. Sunlight spilled through the window, illuminating dust motes in the air. Ruth rested her head lightly against the seatback and let herself feel tired. Not defeated. Earned. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She ignored it until the third vibration. A text from Thomas. They agreed. All of it. Ruth closed her eyes. She did not smile. Agreement was only the beginning. She typed back a single word. Document. Minutes later, another message arrived. From Karen. "Thank you." Ruth typed back. "Stay steady." Across the aisle, the man in the window seat shifted, glanced at Ruth, then looked away. He had been watching her out of the corner of his eye since boarding. He had noticed the way the crew spoke to her, the way Karen had nodded. He didn't know what it meant, only that he had misjudged something. He cleared his throat. "Long flight ahead," he said, attempting neutrality. "Yes," Ruth replied. He hesitated. "You travel a lot?" "Enough," Ruth said. He nodded, satisfied with that. Halfway through the flight, turbulence rattled the cabin. The seatbelt sign chimed on. The attendant made an announcement, voice steady. Ruth watched hands grip armrests, watched eyes widen and then settle. She felt the plane respond, correcting itself, finding balance again. This was what systems did when designed properly. They adjusted. They absorbed stress without collapsing. When the turbulence passed, Karen walked the cabin. Not hurried, not hovering. She checked on a man with a cast, spoke softly to a nervous flyer. When she reached Ruth, she paused. "Everything okay?" Karen asked. "Yes," Ruth said. "It is." Karen smiled, just barely, then moved on. The rest of the flight passed without incident. No laughter, no edge, no performance. Just work being done. As the plane began its descent, Ruth felt a familiar sense of completion. Not triumph. Closure. The quiet satisfaction of seeing something tested and not entirely failing. The wheels touched down smoothly. Applause rippled through the cabin, brief and polite. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers surged forward, impatient. The man beside Ruth stood immediately, blocking her exit without realizing it. She waited. He noticed, flushed slightly, and stepped aside. "Sorry," he said. "Thank you," Ruth replied. She moved into the aisle, lifted her bag, and joined the slow procession toward the exit. As she passed the galley, Karen stood there, hands clasped behind her back. They exchanged a look. No words. On the jet bridge, Ruth paused, letting the line thin ahead of her. She felt the vibration of her phone again. This time she answered. "Yes," she said. A pause. Then, "No press. Not yet." Another pause. "Because this isn't about them learning my name." She ended the call and stepped into the terminal. People streamed past, chasing connections, chasing coffee, chasing time. Ruth merged into the flow, anonymous once more. Exactly where she wanted to be. Behind her, on the aircraft she had just left, a small thing had happened. A crew had done their jobs without distortion. A system had been nudged toward integrity. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't redemption. But it was movement. And sometimes, movement was everything. The first headline did not use her name. It never did at the beginning. It talked about governance concerns, about deferred capital, about a legacy airline facing renewed scrutiny. Ruth Bennett read it on her phone while standing in line at a neighborhood grocery store 3 days later. The cart in front of her filled with ordinary things. Bread, apples, milk, a box of tea she liked because it reminded her of her mother. The cashier chatted with the man ahead of her about the weather. No one recognized her. That, more than anything, told her the timing was right. Silverway Airlines issued its internal memo that afternoon. Carefully worded, measured. No blame, no names. Words like review, commitment, values, forward-looking. Ruth read it once, then again, noting what was missing. No reference to laughter. No acknowledgement of the small humiliations that never made it into official language. She closed the document and set the phone down on her kitchen table, the wood scarred from years of use. She stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the surface, feeling the quiet settle. The next call came from Thomas Avery just after sunset. His voice was different now, less cautious, sharper. They agreed to the structure, he said. Independent oversight, anonymous reporting through external counsel. Promotion criteria revised. Karen Whitfield elevated into an advisory role with direct access to leadership. Not a favor, a safeguard. Ruth listened without interrupting, her gaze drifting to the window where the streetlights flickered on, one by one. "And the funding," Thomas said, finally. Ruth took a breath. "Phase 1, she said. Limited, conditional. I will not accelerate what is not proven it can hold." He did not argue. That told her more than any assurance could. 2 weeks later, she boarded another Silverway flight. Same airline, different city, same seat, middle, economy. She wore the same kind of clothes she always did when she wanted to disappear. The purse was lighter this time. The velvet case stayed at home. She did not need symbols anymore. The gate area buzzed with the familiar tension of delayed boarding. A young agent worked through a backlog of questions, his voice steady, his patience fraying but intact. Ruth watched him carefully. When an older man struggled to understand a rebooking policy, the agent leaned forward, lowered his voice, explained it twice without condescension. Ruth made a note in her head. Not praise, recognition. On the plane, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. No exaggerated warmth, no selective charm. Just work. Ruth sat between a woman reading a paperback and a man asleep before takeoff. The armrests were claimed, then released without comment. A small thing, a meaningful one. During the flight, Karen walked the aisle once, then again. She did not hover near Ruth. She did not need to. Their exchange came later, in the galley, brief and unremarkable to anyone watching. Karen looked tired. She also looked steady in a way Ruth recognized from long battles fought without applause. "They're watching now," Karen said softly. "They always were, Ruth replied. They just didn't know it. Change did not arrive as a wave. It arrived as friction. A supervisor pushing back against a joke that would once have passed. A complaint logged instead of softened. A meeting that ran long because someone insisted on clarity. Ruth tracked it all from a distance, through reports and quiet conversations, through numbers that shifted slowly, stubbornly. The markets reacted next. Analysts speculated. Some praised restraint, others criticized hesitation. Ruth ignored them. She had learned early that noise was not insight. She focused on the data that mattered. Retention in frontline roles, complaint resolution times, internal survey responses that shifted from neutral to cautiously hopeful. 3 months in, the board invited her to speak, not to announce funding, to address culture. She stood at the head of the table, the same place she had stood before, and spoke without notes. She talked about reflexes, about dignity as an operational metric, about how systems revealed themselves not under scrutiny, but under neglect. She did not mention the flight. She did not need to. Everyone in the room knew which moment had brought them there. Afterward, an executive approached her privately. "I didn't think it was that bad," he said. Not defensively, but honestly. Ruth met his eyes. "It wasn't," she said, until it was. 6 months later, Silverway's numbers stabilized. Not spectacular, honest. The airline did not reinvent itself. It corrected course. Sometimes that was enough. Ruth authorized the next phase of funding, quietly, without ceremony. The press eventually learned her name. They always did. Profiles followed. Headlines caught up. Some praised her resolve. Others accused her of theatrics. Ruth read none of it. What she did read was a handwritten note that arrived one morning in a plain envelope. The handwriting was careful, uneven, from a flight attendant on a regional route. "Thank you for making it possible to say something without losing everything." Ruth folded the note and placed it in her desk drawer, alongside others like it. This was the ledger she kept. The next time she flew Silverway, a young attendant offered her water before she asked. No ice, just as she liked it. The attendant offered the same to the man beside her, the woman across the aisle, the child kicking the seat behind. No shift in tone, no performance. Ruth felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. Not pride, but confirmation. As the plane climbed, she looked out the window, watching the ground recede. She thought of the laugh that had started all of this, how small it had been, how loud its echo became when it met consequence. She did not feel vindicated. She felt resolved. Real power, she knew, was not the ability to punish. It was the discipline to observe, the patience to wait, and the willingness to act when silence would be easier. It was sitting in the middle seat long enough to see the truth, then standing up when standing mattered. The plane leveled out. The cabin settled. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, alert, present, exactly where she intended to be. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments with 3 words: dignity over seats.